Someone laughed just as the German Shepherd broke formation. The sharp command echoed across the emergency entrance. Rex, heel. But the dog ignored it for the first time in 8 years of flawless service. Every Navy SEAL outside the ambulance froze. Inside, a wounded operator struggled to breathe while seconds slipped away. And across the crowded trauma bay, the only person the military dog seemed determined to reach was the nurse everyone had been mocking all morning. Sorry. Emily Carter's words caught halfway in her throat as another burst of laughter rippled through the nurse's station. She lowered her eyes, tightened her grip on a clipboard, and waited for the jokes to finish before trying again. The patient's vitals. Take your time, one resident interrupted with an exaggerated grin. Maybe we'll all retire before you finish the sentence. A couple of interns chuckled. Someone whispered that the new nurse was sweet, but probably too nervous for emergency medicine. Emily didn't defend herself. She simply nodded once, turned toward Trauma Room 3, and quietly corrected in 4-line that had begun to kink against the bed rail. The monitor steadied almost instantly. Nobody noticed except the elderly patient who managed a grateful smile before being wheeled upstairs. Emily returned to stocking supplies as though nothing had happened. Then every light near the ambulance entrance flashed red. Security doors slid open. Heavy boots struck polished floors in perfect rhythm. A trauma coordinator hurried across the hallway, voice rising above the sudden commotion. Military emergency incoming. Priority Alpha. Conversations died mid-sentence. Through the glass doors, black SUVs lined the curb while Navy SEALs escorted a stretcher toward the entrance with disciplined precision. At their center walked a broad-shouldered commander, holding the leash of a sable German Shepherd wearing tactical gear. The dog never looked left or right. It moved like part of the formation itself. Emily glanced up only once. Her hands paused over a tray of sterile dressings for barely a heartbeat before continuing exactly where they had left off. No gasp, no curiosity, just another quiet inhale. The commander noticed the waiting trauma team and gave a crisp nod. Gunshot survivor. Stable but deteriorating. We need your best people. Before anyone answered, Emily stepped toward the incoming stretcher with a fresh oxygen setup already assembled. Oh, oxygen ready, she managed softly. A senior physician reached across her shoulder and pulled the equipment away. Not you. Stay back. Let experienced staff handle this one. Emily stopped immediately, retreating without protest. But instead of returning to the supply cabinet, she watched the patient's breathing pattern for a single silent second. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Then she changed direction, crossed to another crash cart, and quietly replaced a smaller airway kit with a larger one no one had requested. An orderly frowned. Who told you to do that? Emily opened her mouth, hesitated, then answered in her familiar stutter. And no one. The orderly shook his head, clearly unconvinced. Before he could argue further, a deep bark shattered the disciplined silence outside. Heads snapped toward the entrance. Rex's ears shot forward. The military dog planted its paws, ignored the commander's firm tug on the leash, and stared straight through the crowded emergency department, locking onto Emily as though it had just recognized someone it had never forgotten. Have you ever trusted a dog's instinct more than the people standing in the room? Rex did not bark again. He simply held his gaze on Emily Carter, muscles tense but perfectly still, as though every hour of disciplined training had been replaced by one impossible certainty. Commander Ryan Brooks tightened his grip on the leash without raising his voice. Rex, heel. The German Shepherd obeyed half a step before stopping again, refusing to look away from the quiet nurse. The hallway filled with uneasy silence. Navy SEAL handlers exchanged brief glances that said more than words ever could. One of them quietly checked the dog's harness as if expecting a loose buckle or faulty strap. There was nothing wrong. Emily lowered her eyes and continued organizing the larger airway kit she had selected moments earlier. Her hands moved with calm precision, checking the seal, confirming the tubing, arranging every item in the exact order it would be needed. She never looked toward the dog again. She picked the wrong size, one resident muttered after noticing the equipment. The patient does not need that. Emily hesitated before answering. Is His breathing rhythm is changing. The words came slowly, each one fighting through her stutter. The swelling may get worse. The resident barely glanced toward the stretcher before shaking his head. His airway is stable enough. Stay with supply duty. Emily nodded once. She did not argue. Instead, she quietly placed the larger kit beside the trauma room door where anyone could reach it without searching. The action drew a puzzled look from a veteran respiratory therapist who had been watching from across the hall. He frowned, then looked toward the incoming patient with fresh attention. Before he could speak, alarms chimed from the transport monitor. The wounded operator's oxygen level dipped several points within seconds. The stretcher accelerated toward Trauma Room 1. Doctors surrounded the patient while nurses moved in practiced rhythm, but the doorway became crowded with too many people trying to help at once. Emily stepped backward instead of forward. She studied the reflections on the monitor glass rather than the numbers themselves, then quietly reached behind a supply cabinet and rolled an unused suction cart into the hallway without being asked. "Who ordered that?" Another nurse called after her. Emily answered without stopping. "No one." Less than 15 seconds later, one of the physicians turned sharply. "We need suction now." The cart was already waiting beside his elbow. He paused for the smallest fraction of a second before taking it, never realizing who had placed it there. The respiratory therapist noticed. So did Commander Brooks. Neither man said a word. Brooks only glanced once from the equipment to Emily, then back to Rex, whose ears remained locked forward despite every attempt to redirect him. The atmosphere inside the emergency department shifted. It was no longer just curiosity. It was uncertainty. Staff members began watching the quiet nurse from the corners of their eyes without understanding why. Emily kept working as though nothing around her had changed, replacing an empty medication tray, checking another oxygen cylinder, adjusting a stretcher brake that nobody else had seen was unlocked. Tiny actions, invisible until the moment they mattered. Then the transport monitor sounded again, this time longer and sharper than before. A physician looked toward the patient's face, then immediately reached for the larger airway kit sitting exactly where Emily had left it. His hand stopped halfway. He turned slowly toward her, confusion replacing confidence, because she had prepared for the complication nearly a full minute before anyone else realized it was coming. At that exact moment, Rex pulled against the leash harder than ever before, and Commander Brooks stared at Emily with an expression that suggested he was no longer trying to understand the dog. He was trying to understand her. The physician reached for the larger airway kit without taking his eyes off the patient, then stopped halfway as realization crossed his face. "Who put this here?" No one answered. Emily was already replacing empty saline bags on another cart, trying to disappear into the background before anyone noticed. "Forget it," the physician said, taking the kit anyway. "Use it." Within moments, the adjustment relieved the growing airway concern, and the patient's oxygen reading climbed back into a safer range. The crisis eased just enough for everyone in the room to breathe again. But instead of bringing relief, it left an uncomfortable silence behind. More than one pair of eyes drifted toward the quiet nurse, who had somehow anticipated the problem before the monitor had fully revealed it. The resident who had mocked her earlier frowned. "Lucky guess," he muttered, though his voice carried less confidence than before. Emily never responded. She simply checked another monitor cable that had begun slipping loose from its connector and secured it before anyone else noticed the intermittent signal. The monitor stabilized immediately. A respiratory therapist watched her hands instead of her face now. They moved without hesitation, economical and deliberate, never wasting motion. Not rushed, not nervous, just practiced. Then another unexpected complication arrived. The patient began reacting poorly to the transfer onto the trauma bed as multiple staff members reached in from different angles, creating confusion instead of coordination. Emily looked across the crowded room for only a second before quietly moving one supply stand 3 feet to the left. "Please leave that where it is," the resident snapped. Emily hesitated. "The path," she said softly through her stutter. "It will block." Before she finished, the physician pushing the stretcher instinctively followed the newly opened space. The transfer became smooth instead of chaotic. No equipment collided. No tubing tangled. The resident looked around, suddenly realizing the room had become easier to work in because of a change he had almost prevented. He said nothing. Commander Ryan Brooks noticed something entirely different. Emily never stared at the patient for long. She kept scanning the entire room instead, as though every person, every monitor, every piece of equipment formed part of the same picture. It reminded him of professionals who always expected the next problem before the current one was solved. Rex noticed it too. The German Shepherd had finally stopped pulling against the leash, yet his eyes never left Emily. His breathing slowed. His posture softened. It was not excitement anymore. It looked almost like recognition. Brooks quietly crouched beside his partner and spoke in a calm voice. "Do you know her?" Rex answered only by giving one slow wag of his tail without looking away. Brooks straightened again, saying nothing, but the question lingered in his expression. Across the trauma bay, Emily reached for a pair of gloves. As she pulled them on, she adjusted each fingertip with the same precise sequence every single time, an oddly disciplined habit that caught the attention of the respiratory therapist. He frowned as though he had seen that routine somewhere before, but could not place it. Emily stepped back once more, careful not to interfere with the physicians now that the immediate danger had eased. For the first time that morning, no one laughed when she spoke. They simply watched. The atmosphere had changed. She was still the stuttering nurse. She was still the newest employee in the department. Yet something about her no longer fit the picture everyone had formed only minutes earlier. Then the trauma room doors opened again. Another Navy SEAL entered carrying a sealed tactical medical pack that had accompanied the patient from the field. He scanned the room, ignored every physician, every administrator, every uniform in sight, and stopped the instant his eyes landed on Emily. The Navy SEAL carrying the sealed tactical medical pack slowed as he reached the doorway, his eyes fixed on Emily instead of the attending physician. For a brief second, it looked as though he intended to hand the case directly to her. Then he caught himself, shifted course, and passed it to Commander Ryan Brooks without a word. Brooks accepted it, but never broke eye contact with Emily. The hesitation lasted barely a heartbeat, yet everyone close enough to notice felt it. Why had a seasoned operator instinctively moved toward the newest nurse in the department? Emily never reacted. She simply continued preparing fresh supplies as another trauma alert echoed through the emergency department. A second ambulance was only minutes away. Charge Nurse Allison crossed the room with clipped urgency. "Emily, I need you covering Trauma Bay 2. Emily glanced toward Trauma Bay 1, where the Navy SEAL patient remained surrounded by physicians. Then she looked toward the hallway where another stretcher would arrive at any moment. Neither choice was good. If she stayed, another team would be short-staffed. If she left, the room that had quietly begun depending on her preparation would lose another set of experienced eyes. She chose Trauma Bay 2 without hesitation, rolling a supply cart toward the neighboring room. Brooks watched her leave, his expression tightening with quiet curiosity rather than relief. The moment Emily entered the second bay, she noticed something nobody had mentioned. One portable monitor had been plugged into emergency battery power instead of the wall outlet after the morning rush. The indicator light was already flashing low. Without announcing it, she exchanged the unit for a fully charged monitor before the incoming patient arrived. Less than a minute later, another nurse reached for the original machine and stopped in surprise when she realized the battery would have failed during transport. "Who switched this?" she asked. No one answered. Emily was already helping position blankets on the empty bed. Another invisible problem had disappeared before becoming a crisis, but this time the charge nurse noticed. She looked at Emily longer than before, not with skepticism, but with growing uncertainty. Across the hall, Brooks opened the tactical medical pack just enough to inventory its contents. Everything inside followed military organization so precise that even the labels aligned in perfect order. One item was missing from its assigned pocket. He frowned, searched again, then looked toward the trauma room where Emily had quietly left an identical piece of equipment ready before anyone requested it. Coincidence, he told himself. Yet the thought refused to settle. Rex suddenly lifted his head again, tracking Emily as she moved between the two trauma bays. The dog did not bark or strain against the leash this time. Instead, he sat perfectly still, watching every step she took as though waiting for an unspoken command that never came. One of the younger SEALs noticed. "He has never focused on a stranger like that," he whispered. Brooks offered no reply. Emily finished preparing Trauma Bay 2, just as the second ambulance was redirected to another hospital, leaving the room unexpectedly empty. Before anyone could assign her elsewhere, a physician from Trauma Bay 1 stepped into the hallway. "We need another pair of hands." He scanned the nearby staff, then stopped on Emily. Earlier that morning, he would never have chosen her. Now, almost without realizing it, he had. Emily nodded once and started toward Trauma Bay 1. Halfway there, Brooks reached the doorway holding the sealed tactical medical pack against his side. He stepped aside to let her pass, but as she moved by, his eyes fell to the way she instinctively checked every exit, every monitor, every person in the room before crossing the threshold. It was not fear. It was habit. Brooks remained motionless for a long second, then slowly turned to watch her disappear into Trauma Bay 1, realizing that whatever mystery surrounded the quiet nurse was no longer staying outside the room. It was walking straight into the center of it. The instant Emily Carter crossed into Trauma Bay 1, the lead physician looked up from the patient and spoke without thinking. "Take airway support." The words surprised everyone in the room, including the physician himself. 10 minutes earlier, he had refused to let her touch the case. Now pressure had quietly rewritten instinct. Emily stepped to the bedside, not taking control, but watching every movement already in progress. She saw the patient's breathing improve, then hesitate again. The monitor numbers were acceptable, yet his shoulders told a different story. She had two choices: interrupt a treatment that was working well enough or trust that the warning signs would pass. Neither option was safe. She chose neither. Instead, she calmly adjusted the patient's position by only a few inches, asking another nurse to support the shoulder while she stabilized the neck. The change looked almost insignificant until the breathing pattern immediately became smoother. Nobody applauded. Nobody spoke. The room simply became easier to work in. Commander Ryan Brooks watched from the doorway, saying nothing. He had seen experienced combat medics make adjustments that small because they understood that inches sometimes mattered more than equipment. He had not expected to see the same judgment inside a civilian emergency department. Before the moment could settle, another problem surfaced. The patient reacted unexpectedly during the next stage of treatment, forcing the physician to choose between continuing the current plan or changing direction entirely. Emily remained silent until she noticed a small detail near the patient's tactical vest that everyone else had overlooked. A medical information tag had shifted beneath the fabric during transport. She carefully exposed it without disturbing the treatment already underway. The physician glanced at the tag and immediately altered the medication plan to match the documented field care. The adjustment prevented an unnecessary conflict with what had already been administered before arrival. It was not dramatic. It was simply correct. Yet Brooks felt the room change again. Emily had not overridden anyone. She had protected the process itself. Across the trauma bay, one of the younger SEALs quietly studied her. He leaned toward another operator and whispered, "She noticed the field tag before any of us." The second operator did not answer. His attention had drifted to Emily's hands. Every instrument she accepted was returned to exactly the same position. Every movement left the workspace cleaner than she found it. The rhythm felt strangely familiar, although neither man could explain why. Then Rex stood up. Without pulling the leash or making a sound, the German Shepherd walked as close to Emily as Brooks allowed. The dog stopped beside her, lowered his head, and waited. Emily never reached for him. She never spoke to him. As she shifted slightly to avoid blocking the physicians, the back of her hand brushed the dog's shoulder for less than a second. Rex closed his eyes and relaxed immediately, as though that brief contact had answered a question only he understood. Brooks felt something tighten in his chest. This was no longer coincidence. Before he could act on the thought, a trauma nurse hurried across the room carrying the sealed tactical medical pack that Brooks had set aside. "Commander," she called, "we found the missing item." Brooks looked inside. The empty pocket was no longer empty. A compact emergency tool rested exactly where military protocol required it to be. No one had seen who returned it. No one remembered removing it. Brooks slowly lifted his eyes toward Emily. She was already helping secure fresh monitoring lines, completely focused on the patient. She had never gone near the pack while anyone was watching. The mystery should have ended there. Instead, it became impossible to ignore. The lead physician stepped back from the bedside, scanned the room once, then looked directly at Emily. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Do not leave this trauma bay." Before Emily could answer, another alarm echoed through the department, and a hospital security officer appeared at the doorway with an urgent message that caused every Navy SEAL in the room to turn at once. The security officer stopped at the doorway, breathing hard. "The military transport team needs immediate access to the field treatment record. Their encrypted tablet just locked out." Every Navy SEAL turned toward Commander Ryan Brooks, but Brooks looked at Emily. The patient had stabilized only enough to buy time. Without the field record, the physicians could not confirm what had already been given before arrival, and repeating the wrong medication could undo everything they had gained. Emily had one safe choice: step back and let military personnel handle military equipment. Instead, she looked at the patient, then at the falling clock on the wall. "Bring the tablet here." The officer hesitated. Brooks did not. He handed it to her. Emily accepted the device with both hands, pressed two side controls in a sequence too quick to be accidental, and opened an emergency medical screen none of the hospital staff had known existed. A younger SEAL stared at her fingers. Brooks stared at her face. She found the treatment log, but the last entry was incomplete. The field medic had started documenting an intervention and never finished. Emily could either trust the partial record or delay treatment until the transport team verified it. She chose the risk that protected the patient. "Do not repeat the dose," she said, her stutter barely present now. "Treat the reaction first." The lead physician studied the incomplete line, then followed her recommendation. The patient's breathing settled, but the decision placed the entire room on Emily's judgment. Respect arrived without ceremony. The physician moved aside and gave her a clear view of the monitors. The charge nurse stopped assigning her minor tasks. Brooks stepped closer, no longer observing from the doorway. With every inch of trust they gave her, the weight on her shoulders grew heavier. Then the tablet displayed a faded training code beside the unfinished entry. Emily's thumb froze over the screen. For one instant, the trauma bay vanished from her eyes. A rotor beat seemed to return in the hum of the ventilation system. Her breathing shortened. Rex rose immediately. Emily shut the memory down before it could reach her face and handed the tablet back. "That code means the medic expected rapid transport," she said. She did not explain how she knew. One of the SEALs quietly opened the tactical pack and compared its layout with the screen. The arrangement matched Emily's earlier preparation exactly. Another piece settled into place. Not enough to name her. Too much to ignore. The lead physician asked her to remain at the patient's side while he contacted surgery. Emily glanced through the glass toward the rest of the emergency department, where her assigned patients still needed care. Staying protected the man in front of her. Leaving protected everyone who had no military team watching over them. She made the harder choice. "Allison can cover my rooms for 5 minutes," she said. "After that, I go back unless he worsens." It was not ambition. It was duty divided evenly, even when no division was fair. Brooks heard the answer and lowered his eyes for a moment, as though it reminded him of someone he had once trusted with impossible choices. The patient suddenly tightened his hand around Emily's wrist. His eyes opened only halfway, unfocused beneath the lights. He did not call her Nurse Carter. He whispered a single word that made Rex step forward and every SEAL in the room go still. "Ghost." The word changed the room. Not because anyone understood it completely, but because Emily did. Her hand tightened once beneath the patient's grip, then relaxed as the monitor tone shifted into a dangerous rhythm. The lead physician moved toward the crash cart, but Emily had already seen the pattern forming. "He is not tolerating the pressure change," she said, her voice low and steady. Lower the head of the bed. Support the airway. Do not rush the next medication. There was no perfect choice. Waiting risked losing precious time. Moving too fast risked pushing the patient past the point where the team could recover him. Emily chose control over speed. She placed one hand at the patient's shoulder, directed the respiratory therapist with 3 precise instructions, and guided the team through a slower correction while every second pressed against them. The monitor faltered, steadied, then climbed. The patient's grip loosened. His breathing returned in shallow but reliable waves. Only when the immediate danger passed did Commander Ryan Brooks step closer. His eyes moved from the encrypted tablet to the military medical pack, then to Rex standing beside Emily, as though he had finally reached the person he had been searching for. Brooks spoke quietly. Ghost was the call sign used by one combat medic attached to our restricted operations team. Emily did not answer. She adjusted the blanket over the patient and checked the oxygen line again. One of the younger SEALs looked toward the emergency tool that had been returned to the exact military position. Another remembered the way she had opened the field record. The pieces no longer looked separate. The larger airway kit, the battlefield organization, the exit checks, the way Rex had broken formation before anyone else understood. Brooks continued with only what the room already knew. She disappeared from active records after the last mission tied to that unit. The patient opened his eyes again. This time they focused. He looked at Emily, then at Brooks. She kept us alive, he whispered. No one asked for more. No one needed more. The lead physician turned toward Emily, but instead of offering praise, he handed her responsibility. Surgery is delayed 3 minutes. I need you to stay with him until the transport team arrives. The reveal had not freed her. It had placed the most fragile minutes of the case directly in her hands. Emily accepted without hesitation. She monitored the patient's breathing, corrected the angle of the oxygen mask, and spoke to him in short, calm sentences that gave him something steady to follow. Her stutter returned on one word, then another. Nobody looked away. Nobody interrupted. The resident who had mocked her moved silently to the side and cleared the path before she asked. The respiratory therapist placed the next instrument into her hand without question. Rex lowered himself beside the bed, eyes fixed on the patient now, trusting Emily to hold the room together. When the surgical transport team finally arrived, Brooks stepped back and gave Emily the space usually reserved for command. She guided the handoff with exact details, never mentioning her past, never using the call sign, never asking to be recognized. Only after the stretcher rolled toward the elevator did the room exhale. Then the patient lifted 2 fingers weakly from beneath the blanket. Rex stood. Emily saw the gesture and followed the stretcher 1 step farther than hospital protocol required. Brooks watched her face and realized the truth had not ended the story. It had reopened a wound she had spent years learning to carry, and now the man she had once saved was being taken through another set of closing doors. The elevator doors closed with the stretcher inside, and the emergency department fell into a silence that felt different from the one that had followed Rex's first bark. No one was waiting for Emily to explain herself now. The resident who had mocked her stepped aside before she reached the nurse's station and quietly placed the larger airway kit back in its proper drawer. He checked the seal twice. Across the room, the charge nurse reassigned Emily's waiting patients without being asked, then left one chart open beside a fresh cup of water. The respiratory therapist returned the suction cart to storage, but before he did, he arranged every item in the same exact order Emily had used. Small changes. No speeches. No applause. Emily barely noticed them. A child in a nearby treatment room began crying when a blood pressure cuff tightened around his arm. She turned away from Commander Brooks, from the watching physicians, from the name that had just followed her out of the past, and crouched beside the bed. Her first attempt at reassurance caught in her throat. The boy looked at her, waiting. Emily slowed her breathing and tried again. It is just a squeeze. We can count together. The child nodded. By the time they reached 5, the reading was complete and his hand had stopped trembling. When Emily stood, Brooks was still there, but his expression had changed. He did not ask about Ghost. He did not ask about the unit. He only moved aside so she could return to work. Rex remained beside him, alert and quiet. Emily crossed the trauma bay to replace a monitor lead, then paused when she saw the dog watching her. Brooks loosened the leash. Not enough to release him, just enough to let him choose. Rex looked up at his handler once. Brooks gave the smallest nod. The German Shepherd walked across the polished floor without urgency, every step measured, and stopped in front of Emily exactly where he had stopped before. This time no command followed. Emily lowered one hand. Rex pressed his forehead into her palm and closed his eyes. The room kept moving around them. Wheels rolled. Monitors chimed. A phone rang unanswered for one beat too long. Yet for several quiet seconds, the dog stood perfectly still beneath her hand, and Emily's shoulders finally lowered as though she had been carrying weight no one else could see. She did not say his name. She did not need to. Rex gave one slow wag of his tail. Then he stepped back and returned to Brooks on his own. The commander clipped the leash shorter, but instead of leading the team away, he brought his hand to his chest in a silent gesture of respect. The younger SEALs followed, not in ceremony, but in recognition. Emily answered with a small nod and turned toward the next patient. As she passed the nurse's station, the same resident who had once joked about waiting for her sentence held out a chart. He did not finish the words for her when she began to speak. He simply waited. Emily took the chart, looked toward the crowded hallway, and continued in her own time. Behind her, Rex settled beside Brooks, calm at last. The dog who had broken formation now watched the quiet nurse return to her shift, and no one in the room laughed when she spoke. The next morning, the emergency department looked exactly as it always had. Stretchers rolled through automatic doors. Phones rang. Coffee cooled beside computer terminals. The waiting room filled and emptied in quiet waves. Emily Carter clipped on her identification badge, checked the supply cabinets, and straightened a box of gloves that someone had left slightly out of place. No one announced her arrival. No one needed to. The resident who had once finished her sentences for her paused outside a patient room while a new nursing student struggled through her first report. He waited without interrupting until she found the words herself. Across the hallway, the respiratory therapist opened a fresh airway kit and arranged every item in careful order before placing it back on the cart. The charge nurse walked past an unfamiliar patient, noticed a blanket slipping from an elderly man's shoulder, and quietly tucked it back into place before continuing toward another call light. Emily moved from room to room as she always had, stopping to tighten an intravenous line, helping an anxious family find the correct waiting area, kneeling beside a frightened little girl so she could place a colorful bandage on her own finger before receiving a routine vaccination. She smiled when the child smiled, then stood and returned to the next chart waiting on her clipboard. The morning never slowed long enough for anyone to mention the previous day. Near the ambulance entrance, Commander Ryan Brooks prepared to leave with the remaining members of his team after receiving word that the patient had reached surgery in stable condition. Rex sat quietly beside him, watching the busy emergency department through the glass doors. Brooks glanced once toward Emily. She was speaking softly to an elderly woman whose hearing aid had slipped loose. The words caught for a moment as her familiar stutter returned, but neither of them hurried. The woman simply waited, and Emily finished in her own time. Brooks gave one final nod, turned, and walked outside. Rex followed without hesitation. Just before reaching the waiting vehicle, the German Shepherd stopped, looked back through the glass one last time, and found Emily across the crowded hallway. She happened to look up at the same moment. Neither moved. Neither called out. Emily lifted 2 fingers in the smallest wave. Rex answered with one slow wag of his tail before turning back to his handler. The doors closed behind them. Inside the emergency department, another trauma alert sounded overhead. Emily placed her clipboard on the counter, reached automatically for the larger airway kit, and hurried toward the incoming patient. This time no one questioned the choice. As she passed the nurse's station, someone accidentally dropped a clipboard. Papers scattered across the polished floor just as they had scattered around her confidence the day before. Emily stopped, gathered every page without a word, placed the stack back into the young nurse's hands, and continued toward the trauma bay before anyone could thank her. The hallway swallowed her into another ordinary shift. The laughter from yesterday was gone. Only the steady rhythm of helping people remained. And somewhere beyond the hospital walls, a Navy SEAL's faithful K-9 carried on with his mission, while the quiet nurse he had recognized first disappeared once more into the place where she had always belonged.